In the summer of 1940, as Nazi tanks rolled across Europe and the world held its breath, the United States Army issued a challenge that every major automaker in America refused. Build us a vehicle that doesn't exist. Make it weigh less than a motorcycle but haul soldiers through mud, sand and snow. Give it the power of a truck but the size of a compact car. And here's the impossible part. Deliver a working prototype in just 49 days. 135 manufacturers received that letter. 132 threw it in the trash. But in a struggling factory in Toledo, Ohio, a 48-year-old engineer named Barney Roos read that impossible brief, and he saw something no one else could see. He saw victory. What happened next would create the most important vehicle of the 20th century, and the engine at its heart would help win a war. This is the untold story of the Jeep engine that won World War II. To understand why a small engine mattered more than battleships and bombers, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1940. Europe was falling fast. In May of that year, the German military launched its blitzkrieg across Western Europe. The strategy was terrifyingly simple: move faster than your enemy can think. Tanks, motorcycles, and mechanized infantry swept through Belgium, the Netherlands, and into France with a speed that made the Allied forces look frozen in time. By June, Paris had fallen. Britain stood alone. And across the Atlantic, the United States military faced a terrifying realization: they weren't ready. Here's what most people don't know. In 1940, the American army was smaller than the army of Portugal. The United States ranked 17th in the world for military strength, behind Romania, behind the Netherlands, behind nations that had already been conquered. And their equipment? It was World War I leftovers. The backbone of American military transport was the horse. Yes, horses. In 1940, the US Army still relied on animal transport for a significant portion of its logistics. But a small group of military planners saw the future clearly. They watched German motorcycles with sidecars zip across battlefields, while American soldiers marched on foot. They saw Wehrmacht vehicles climb terrain that would strand any Allied truck. And they understood one brutal truth: whoever controlled mobility controlled the war. So, on July 11, 1940, the US Army Quartermaster Corps sent out a procurement request that would change history. They needed a vehicle that could do something no vehicle had ever done. The Army's requirements read like a fever dream from an engineer's nightmare. First, the vehicle must weigh no more than 1,300 pounds. To put that in perspective, a modern electric bicycle weighs about 50 pounds. A typical sedan weighs around 3,000. The Army was asking for a full-wheeled vehicle with an engine, drivetrain, and body that weighed about as much as 6 refrigerators stacked together. Second, it must carry a 600-pound payload: soldiers, weapons, equipment, while fully loaded. Third, it must have four-wheel drive to traverse mud, sand, rocks, and snow. Fourth, it must have a wheelbase between 75 and 80 inches. Compact enough to maneuver tight spaces, but stable enough not to tip. Fifth, and this is where most engineers stopped reading, the engine must produce sufficient power to climb a 45-degree grade. And sixth, deliver a working prototype in 49 days, not 49 weeks, not 49 months, 49 days. Military planners had done the math. If Germany invaded Britain, the United States could be next. They needed a miracle vehicle, and they needed it before the calendar turned to 1941. 135 American manufacturers received this request. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, the giants of American industry, all read those specifications and walked away. The weight limit was absurd. The timeline was suicide. The liability was enormous. Ford's engineers calculated that meeting the specifications was physically impossible with existing technology. GM didn't even respond. But 3 tiny companies most Americans had never heard of, decided to take the bet, and the smallest of them all would fire the first shot. The 3 companies that responded to the Army's call were American Bantam, Willys-Overland, and, eventually, Ford. Let's start with the most unlikely hero in this story. American Bantam was, by 1940, a company on life support. Based in Butler, Pennsylvania, they had once manufactured small, affordable cars inspired by British Austin designs. But the Depression had crushed them. They'd declared bankruptcy, reorganized, and were barely scraping by with a skeleton crew. Their factory could produce maybe a few thousand vehicles per year maximum. They had no engineering staff to speak of. They had almost no money. But they had one thing no one else did: desperation so intense it looked like courage. When the Army's request landed on the desk of American Bantam's president, Francis Fenn, he saw a lifeline. If they could win this contract, they could save the company. There was just one problem. They didn't have an engineer capable of designing the vehicle. Karl Probst was a freelance automotive engineer working out of Detroit. He was brilliant, experienced, and, like most freelancers during the Depression, constantly looking for work. When Bantam called, Probst initially said no. The specifications were impossible. The deadline was insane. There was no way. But Bantam's representatives flew to Detroit and begged. They appealed to his patriotism. They appealed to his engineering pride. They appealed to his humanity. On July 17, 1940, Karl Probst arrived at American Bantam's factory in Butler, Pennsylvania. He had no team. He had no blueprints. He had no time. What he did have was a yellow legal pad, a sharp pencil, and an understanding of vehicles that bordered on supernatural. What Karl Probst accomplished in the next 5 days should be studied in every engineering school on Earth. Working 18 to 20 hours per day, fueled by coffee and pure determination, Probst hand-drew complete blueprints for an entirely new class of vehicle. He calculated weight distributions by hand. He designed a frame that could withstand the torque of four-wheel drive. He specified every component, from axles to transfer case, from suspension to steering geometry. By July 22nd, 5 days after arriving, Karl Probst had created the foundational design for what would become the Jeep. American Bantam built the prototype. They met the deadline delivering their vehicle, called the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, to Army testing grounds at Camp Holabird, Maryland, on September 21, 1940. It was the only company to meet the 49-day deadline. The vehicle performed beautifully. Army testers were stunned. This tiny company, with almost no resources, had delivered what the giants of American industry said was impossible. But then something happened that Karl Probst would never forgive. The U.S. Army took Bantam's blueprints, Probst's blueprints, and shared them with Willys-Overland and Ford. The logic was coldly practical. Bantam couldn't mass-produce. They could maybe build 5,000 vehicles. The Army needed hundreds of thousands, so they gave the design to companies that could deliver volume. Karl Probst had saved Bantam for a moment, but he'd unknowingly armed their competitors. While Probst was drawing miracles in Pennsylvania, a different kind of engineer was pacing the floors at Willys-Overland in Toledo, Ohio. Delmar Barney Roos was not a young man chasing glory. He was a 48-year-old industry veteran who had worked for Locomobile, Pierce Arrow, and Studebaker. He understood engines the way poets understand language, with instinct and precision combined. When Roos saw the Army's specifications, he recognized something the Army itself hadn't fully understood. The vehicle wouldn't succeed or fail based on its frame. It would succeed or fail based on its engine. The Willys 441 engine was a workhorse. It was a 104 cubic inch, 4-cylinder flathead design that produced reliable power. It was simple, which meant soldiers could repair it in the field. It was durable, which meant it could survive abuse. But it had a problem. It was too heavy. The engine alone weighed over 500 pounds. Combined with a transmission, transfer case, and drivetrain, Willys' powertrain would consume nearly all of the Army's weight limit before adding the frame, body, fuel tank, or anything else. Every engineer at Willys said the same thing: it can't be done. Barney Roos disagreed. Barney Roos wasn't interested in hearing what couldn't be done. He was interested in finding what could. While other engineers looked at the weight problem as a wall, Roos saw it as a puzzle with a solution hiding in plain sight. His approach was methodical but bordering on obsessive. He ordered every single component of the Willys 441 engine disassembled and weighed individually: pistons, rods, crankshaft, cylinder head, every bolt, every bracket, every gasket. Then he asked a simple question for each component: can we make this lighter without breaking it? Roos redesigned the piston rods, shaving ounces without sacrificing strength. He switched materials where possible, replacing heavy iron components with lighter alloys. He analyzed the cooling system and discovered ways to reduce the water jacket weight. He scrutinized the crankshaft and found metal that served no structural purpose. Every gram mattered. Every ounce was a victory. His colleagues thought he was losing his mind. The weight savings were tiny, a pound here, 2 pounds there. Surely this couldn't add up to anything meaningful. But Roos understood something profound about engineering. Excellence is not one big solution. Excellence is 1,000 small decisions made correctly. Over months of relentless refinement, Barney Roos transformed the Willys 441 into something new. The redesigned engine weighed significantly less than its predecessor while producing more power. 60 horsepower at 4,000 RPM and 105 pound-feet of torque at 2,000 RPM. Those numbers might not sound impressive by modern standards, but in 1940, for an engine this small and light, they were extraordinary. Roos didn't just reduce weight. He improved efficiency. He enhanced durability. He simplified maintenance. The engine earned a nickname on the factory floor, the Go Devil. The Go Devil engine became the heart of the Willys MB, the vehicle that would be standardized as the American military Jeep. Its specifications were elegant in their balance, 134 cubic inches of displacement, small enough to be light, large enough to produce real power. A flathead design with the valves in the block, simpler to manufacture, easier to repair in the field, and more resistant to damage than overhead valve configurations. A low compression ratio that allowed the engine to run on low-quality fuel, crucial in combat zones where premium gasoline was a fantasy, and a torque curve that peaked at low RPM, giving soldiers maximum pulling power when they needed it most, climbing hills and dragging vehicles out of mud. The Go Devil wasn't flashy. It wasn't the most powerful engine ever built, but it might have been the most important. By November 1940, both Willys and Ford had delivered their prototype vehicles, built using insights from Bantam's original design. The Army now had 3 contenders: the Bantam BRC, the original, designed by Karl Probst, but backed by a company with no manufacturing capacity. The Willys Quad, heavier than specification, but powered by the mighty Go Devil engine. The Ford Pygmy, well-built but with an engine that couldn't match the Willys for torque and reliability. Testing was brutal and exhaustive. They were driven through mud pits that swallowed tires. They were forced up grades so steep that normal vehicles would flip backward. They were submerged in water deep enough to drown their engines. They were loaded with soldiers and equipment until their suspension groaned. And at the end of months of testing, one truth emerged. The Go Devil engine was superior. Let's pause and go deep into why the Go Devil engine outperformed its competitors. Because this is where the story becomes a masterclass in engineering excellence. The Ford GPA engine, Ford's competitor, was a good engine. It was reliable. It was adequately powerful, but it was designed for cars. It was optimized for smooth road performance and fuel efficiency at cruising speeds. The Go Devil was designed for war. In combat, vehicles don't cruise. They stop and start. They climb obstacles. They pull loads through impossible terrain. What matters in those conditions isn't horsepower, it's torque, and specifically torque at low engine speeds. Barney Roos understood this. His engine was tuned to produce maximum torque at just 2,000 RPM. That meant a soldier could keep the engine at low speed, saving fuel, reducing noise, and still have full pulling power available instantly. Ford's engine peaked at higher RPMs. To get full power, drivers had to rev higher burning fuel, creating noise and increasing mechanical stress. In testing, this difference was unmistakable. The Willys Quad climbed hills that stalled the Ford. It pulled loads that made the Ford struggle. It did it all while using less fuel, but there was still a problem. Even with all of Roos's weight reductions, the Willys Quad exceeded the Army's weight specification. The original 1,300-pound limit was physically impossible, but the Army had reluctantly raised it to 2,000 pounds for testing. The Willys Quad still came in heavy. This should have disqualified them. Rules are rules. But Army evaluators did something remarkable. They looked past the number on the scale and looked at the performance on the field. The Willys quad could do things no other vehicle could match. Its power-to-weight ratio, even at higher weight, was superior to the lighter competitors. Its reliability was unmatched. Its torque was decisive. In June 1941, the Army made a historic decision. They raised the weight specification to 2,160 pounds, a figure that the Willys could meet. And on July 23, 1941, Willys-Overland won the contract to produce the vehicle that would become legend. But winning the contract was only the beginning. The Army needed hundreds of thousands of these vehicles. Willys-Overland was a small company. They couldn't produce that volume alone. So, the military made a pragmatic decision. Ford would be licensed to build identical vehicles using Willys's design and engine specifications. Between 1941 and 1945, Willys-Overland produced approximately 363,000 Jeeps. Ford produced approximately 280,000 more. American Bantam, the company that had started it all, was sidelined. They built fewer than 3,000 reconnaissance vehicles. Karl Probst's designs saved the world, but not his company. The combined production exceeded 640,000 vehicles, each one powered by Barney Roos's Go Devil engine, 640,000 engines. 640,000 hearts beating inside machines that would cross deserts, storm beaches, and carry victory across 3 continents. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It became a way of life for American soldiers. Its simplicity was its superpower. The Go Devil engine had so few moving parts that mechanics could rebuild it in the field with basic tools. Soldiers who had never touched an engine before the war became experts at keeping their Jeeps running. Journalist Ernie Pyle, who covered the war from the front lines, wrote extensively about the Jeep. He described how soldiers treated their Jeeps like living creatures, naming them, decorating them, and mourning them when they were destroyed. They mounted machine guns on the back. They strapped stretchers across the hood to carry wounded. They used the engine's power takeoff to run electrical generators. They even rigged Jeeps to run on railroad tracks, using them as lightweight locomotives. The vehicle's versatility was matched only by the Go Devil engine's willingness to keep running no matter what. Mechanics reported engines that took shrapnel damage and kept functioning. Engines that ran submerged in salt water during beach landings. Engines that operated in the frozen mud of European winters and the scorching sands of North Africa. The Go Devil earned its name 1,000 times over. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched the largest seaborne invasion in human history. Operation Overlord, D-Day, required the coordination of over 150,000 troops, thousands of ships, and millions of tons of equipment. And among the first vehicles to roll onto the beaches of Normandy were Jeeps. The sand was soft, the obstacles were brutal, the artillery was constant, vehicles bobbed down, trucks stalled, equipment was destroyed. But the Jeeps kept moving. They were light enough to drive across sand that swallowed heavier trucks. They were powerful enough to pull stuck vehicles free. They were small enough to navigate around debris that blocked larger transports. Within hours of the initial landings, Jeeps were racing inland, carrying commanders to the front, evacuating wounded soldiers to medical stations, and laying communication wire across newly liberated territory. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later identify the Jeep as one of the 4 pieces of equipment that most contributed to Allied victory, alongside the C-47 transport plane, the bulldozer, and the amphibious landing craft. While Europe grabbed headlines, the Jeep was equally decisive in the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign presented challenges that would destroy conventional vehicles. Coral roads shredded tires. Tropical humidity corroded metal. Mud during monsoon seasons could swallow trucks whole. Its simple flathead design meant fewer points of failure from moisture. Its low compression allowed it to run on whatever fuel was available, including captured Japanese supplies. Its torque-rich power delivery made it perfect for the stop-and-start nature of jungle warfare. Marines reported using their Jeeps as ambulances through terrain that no ambulance could reach. Army units used them to tow artillery pieces into firing positions, then quickly relocate before counter-battery fire arrived. The Jeep became so valuable that capturing enemy equipment became a secondary priority. Soldiers would risk their lives to recover a disabled Jeep, knowing that its loss meant losing capability that couldn't be replaced. By 1945, the statistics were staggering. Over 640,000 Jeeps built, present in every theatre of war, used by American forces, British forces, Soviet forces, shipped under Lend-Lease to allies across the globe. But numbers don't capture what the Jeep meant. It meant a commander reaching the front to make decisions that saved battalions. It meant supplies arriving at isolated units that would have otherwise been overrun. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff who oversaw the entire American war effort, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Not the atomic bomb. Not the aircraft carrier. Not the B-17 bomber. The Jeep. When the war ended in 1945, the Jeep didn't retire. Soldiers loved these machines. They had survived together. They had a bond. Willys-Overland recognized this and introduced the CJ-2A, the first civilian Jeep in 1945. The CJ stood for Civilian Jeep. Farmers bought them to work their land. Hunters bought them to reach remote areas. Explorers bought them to go where no roads existed. The Go Devil engine continued to power these vehicles into the 1960s, eventually evolving into newer designs, but never abandoning its core philosophy: simple, reliable, powerful. The Jeep brand exists to this day, now owned by Stellantis, still trading on the reputation built during those desperate years of war. What happened to the engineers who created this legend? Karl Probst, the freelancer who designed the original Bantam in 5 Sleepless Days, received little recognition during his lifetime. He never patented his work. He never received royalties. American Bantam paid him $5 for the design that changed history. Probst continued working as an automotive engineer until his death in 1963. In later years, historians began recognizing his contribution, but he remains far less famous than his creation. Delmar Barney Roos continued leading Willys-Overland's engineering department after the war. He oversaw the transition to civilian production and continued refining the engines that bore his fingerprints. He retired in the 1950s, having spent decades building vehicles that ordinary Americans could afford and that soldiers could depend on. Neither man sought glory. Neither man became wealthy from their contributions. They were engineers. They solved problems. They did their jobs. And in doing their jobs, they helped save the world. The story of the Jeep engine isn't just about World War II. It's about what happens when impossible deadlines meet determined people. It's about the difference between designing something to impress and designing something to work. It's about how a 48-year-old engineer, staying late at the office, weighing pistons on a scale, could have more impact on history than 1,000 bureaucrats making speeches. Soldiers won the war, sailors won the war, pilots won the war, but they won it with tools, and the tools mattered. The engine that Barney Roos refined gram by gram, ounce by ounce, became the beating heart of Allied mobility. Every soldier it carried, every wounded man it evacuated, every supply line it kept open. All of that traces back to decisions made in a factory in Toledo, Ohio. There's something the story of the Go Devil engine teaches us that goes far beyond military history. Excellence isn't glamorous. Barney Roos didn't have a moment of brilliant inspiration. He didn't wake up one morning with the perfect solution. He had months of tedious, repetitive, painstaking work. Weighing components, shaving ounces, testing and retesting. The engine that helped win World War II was built one decision at a time, one improved piston rod, one lighter bracket, one more efficient cooling passage, not through genius, through discipline, not through inspiration, through perspiration, not through one big breakthrough, through 1,000 small improvements. Karl Probst taught us that one person, working with focus and urgency, can create something that changes the world. Barney Roos taught us that excellence is a process, not an event, and that the willingness to do unglamorous work is what separates successful engineers from dreamers. In a world that celebrates overnight success and viral moments, the Jeep story is a reminder. Real achievement takes time. Real excellence requires patience. Real impact comes from showing up every day and doing the work that nobody sees. The soldiers who drove those jeeps across Europe and the Pacific never thought about Barney Roos. They didn't know his name. They didn't know about the months he spent shaving grams from engine components. They just knew their jeep started every morning. They knew it pulled them out of mud. They knew it got them home. That's the legacy of engineering done right. No fame, no glory. Just a job done so well that nobody notices how hard it was. The next time you see a Jeep on the road, any Jeep, old or new, take a moment. That vehicle exists because of choices made in 1940 and 1941. Because two engineers refused to accept that something was impossible. Because American industry, when pushed to its limits, found capacity it didn't know it had. The Go Devil engine is gone now, replaced by modern designs with fuel injection and computer controls. But its DNA lives on, the philosophy lives on. Simple, reliable, powerful, ready. That's not just an engine specification. That's a way of building things. That's a way of living. When the world tells you something can't be done, when the specifications are impossible, when the deadline is insane, when everyone else has walked away, that's when the real work begins. Barney Roos didn't build the Go Devil engine because it was easy. He built it because it mattered. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that untold engineering stories deserve to be told, do something small right now. Drop a comment below telling us about a machine or invention that changed your family's life. Maybe it was a vehicle. Maybe it was a tool. Maybe it was something so ordinary you never stopped to think about who built it. Every great invention has a story. And every story has a person who refused to quit. Let's make sure those stories get told.